Welcome back to the Becca's Float Dress Sew-Along. Today we will begin construction. I have my smocking completed. I've also prepared the bodice. It's interfaced and I have applied the piping to it and then pressed the seam allowance to the back, and it's ready to apply to the skirt section of the dress at this point. You can also see here that I have trimmed away the bulk inside the seam allowance of the bodice so that there is not so much fabric tucked in there. I've got the dress pinned to my board just so that it won't slide around. I don't ever block anything, but if you like to block things, then just leave it on the board once it's blocked. And the next step is to apply the yoke to the front of the dress. And to do that, I like to use the Roxanne's Glue Based It. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to apply this Based It glue to the seam allowance on the yoke, and then I will finger press this in place and then leave it and allow it to dry. So make sure when you put your yoke down that you have your 3/8 inch seam allowance off to the side here, about right. And then finger press your yoke to the skirt piece where it needs to be stitched. And again, on this second side, also ensure that you've got your 3/8 inch seam allowance to the outside of the smocked area. So I have this pressed in place, and I'm going to pin it through the piping just to hold this in place until it dries. Once this is dry, I will be able to stitch in the ditch, which is a funny term for stitching right on the seam allowance of the yoke. But I want to leave this to dry and make sure it's completely dry before I attempt to stitch anything. So while it's not quite dry yet, you have the opportunity to move this around a little bit, and I'm going to remove these pins so that I can get a good visual for where this is going to get stitched. I want to move this up just a little bit. So now is the time to get it perfectly accurate. So I've attached the yoke to the dress, and I did a stitch in the ditch stitch, which hopefully you can't see at all. I used a 2.0 stitch length, and that worked very well. So the next step is to trim the seam allowance. First, I'm trimming straight across, and I'm trimming it down to about 1/4 inch. And then I need to trim out the section behind the V here so it's not quite so bulky. So I'm just going to also trim that to about 1/4 inch. You want to be real careful that you don't cut through your bodice when you're doing this, because that would make you cry. So here you can see I've got the seam allowance trimmed nicely on the dress. The next step, turn this over, is going to be to cut out the armholes. And although they were drawn in before I started smocking, they were drawn in order to tie off the dress front to the correct size. I want to go back and ensure that the depth of the armhole is correct. So I'm taking my front yoke and I'm going to overlap it so that the seam matches on the yoke and the armhole piece. Obviously, since I designed this, I have the advantage of having a full lower skirt bodice piece, but you can do this with your armhole on, and you can print the armhole twice, or you can just flip this over to get the second armhole. But what I want to do next is just lay this on top of the pattern and make sure that I cut out the exact correct armhole. And it actually is pretty close to what I've drawn. So I'm going to cut this side. And I want to put a snip in right here to trim off that lower edge. And then I'll do the same for the other side. The reason for doing this, not just cutting out the initial armholes that you have marked, is that sometimes, and I think this was the case with mine, my seam allowance of the skirt was a little bit deeper in order to get the piping aligned perfectly with my first row of smocking. My seam allowance ended up being a little bit deeper than the 3/8 of an inch that was allowed, and that will change slightly the armhole curve. So if I drop down 1/8 of an inch, the depth of the armhole curve also needs to drop down 1/8 of an inch. So it's more accurate if you do things that way. So next we are ready for applying the collar, and I've soaked the collar and then given it a good press. I do have a pin in the center front so that I can align the center front of the collar with the dress, and I'm going to pin that in place. So I need to pin this collar onto the yoke, and then I will apply the spaghetti bias for the outer edge. Now if you've done a solid color and have embroidered directly on the yoke, obviously you won't need to do this. The next step is to apply the spaghetti bias, and when I do this, I will be gluing this down to secure it, but I like to pin it in place first and ensure that I am covering up the cut edge of the collar. When I get to the peak of the collar, I stab a pin to the outside edge of the collar point so that I can miter that corner and turn to pin the upper edge. And then I will pin that miter in. And then I'll repeat this for the second side of the collar, and then I'm going to glue it down to secure and let it dry before stitching. After both collars have the spaghetti bias pinned to them, and before you glue it, you want to ensure that they're even. So you want to make sure that the depth from the peak of the collar to the bottom edge of the yoke is equidistance away, because that would be a real eyesore if it turned out that one was higher than the other. So check that out, and if they look like they're correct to you, and I think this looks good, then go ahead and apply the glue and finger press it down and allow it to dry. In the end, I decided that stabbing the pins into a work surface to hold it until the glue dries worked best. So once this is dry, I will be stitching the spaghetti bias down, and I'll also be basting the neckline of the collar down. And to stitch the spaghetti bias, you can either use a straight stitch and stitch both on the outside and the inside of the spaghetti bias, or you could use a decorative stitch like a blanket stitch, which is what I will choose to use on this one. And if you're doing the blanket stitch, you want to use a water-soluble stabilizer behind the stitching, because you're always going to get better stitch quality if you've got a stabilizer behind the stitching. So I prefer to use the Sulky Super Solvy, which is a stabilizer that looks like interfacing or a weird fabric, and not the usual Solvy that looks like saran wrap. But you can decide which one you feel like works best for you. And for the blanket stitch, I will be setting my blanket stitch settings to a 2.5 stitch length and a 1 or a 1.5 stitch width for the zigzag. And when you're using this stitch, you want to make sure that the straight stitch is right next to the spaghetti bias and the zigzag stitch stitches in just to catch it. And you'll want to use a 60 weight thread to keep it as invisible as possible. And I prefer to use an open-toed foot so that I can see while I'm stitching. This completes the first lesson. Please hit the subscribe button if you wish to continue receiving these videos.